Hello YouTube, today I'll be making a video on FVGs. I'll be talking about the important concepts of how you can use FVGs as a draw on liquidity / void. I'll also be talking about inverse FVGs and institutional FVGs. During the span of this video, I'll be explaining all the concepts directly to my co-founder, Conrad.
Hey, what's up?
And I'm doing this just so I can make sure that you guys all can understand what I'm talking about, because he's someone who doesn't know that much. Let's be honest, doesn't know that much about FVGs. If he understands what I'm talking about, then you guys definitely will. Stay tuned. All right. So first, I want to talk about inverse fair value gaps. So what an inverse fair value gap is called a double stack. A double stack is when two fair value gaps intersect and align with each other. And the first fair value gap in a double stack, see the red one right here? It could not be, the range of the fair value gap could not be touched, or else it would not be considered a double stack. So if it was touched previously, it is not considered a double stack fair value gap. Do you have any questions?
Not really, no.
Okay, now let's talk about how you could use fair value gaps as a draw of liquidity. So whenever there is a gap in price will look to return back to that price in order to meet fair value again. Institutions, they like to get in buys and sells when price is at, they like to buy when price is at fair value. Okay, so price will always look to return to fair value. Do you have any questions about this?
No.
Now let me introduce to you what an institutional fair value gap is. So an institutional fair value gap can be any fair value gap. It does not have to be an inversion fair value gap, like I referred to earlier, when two fair value gaps intersect over each other. It does not have to be that. All it has to be is a candle that taps into a fair value gap. The 50% of the fair value gap's range gets tapped into and rejected off of by the candle that enters that range. Do you have any questions about it?
No.
So what makes an institutional fair value gap institutional is that there's a specific level that gets rejected off of, increasing the algorithmic probability of this fair value gap. Do you have any questions about that?
Nope.
All right. All right, now let's go into the charts, and I'm going to show you guys and Conrad some key examples of what an inverse fair value gap is, an IOFED fair value gap is, and a draw on liquidity fair value gap. So we see here, we have a fair value gap pattern here, and we have a fair value gap pattern here, okay? So what area do these two fair value gaps intersect? Here's where they intersect, okay? So this is our inversion fair value gap. You see, it was not tapped into before the second fair value gap was printed. It was not tapped into, which makes it an inversion fair value gap. So you see here, 50% of the inverse, 50% of the inverse fair value gap's range was not tapped into and rejected off of, which makes this not an IOFED. But you see, it filled the inversion fair value gap and it continued higher. Do you have any questions about inverse fair value gaps?
Nope.
Okay, now let's talk about fair value gaps as a draw on liquidity. So you see here, we have this giant void slash fair value gap that was printed. Price came back up to return and fill all of this empty space, or this draw on liquidity right here. It came back and it filled this liquidity and returned to fair value. Do you have any questions about fair value gaps as a draw on liquidity?
Nope.
Now let's see if we could find an example of fair value gaps as an IOFED. So you could see here, Conrad, that we have an IOFED. An IOFED, as I said earlier, was when 50% of the range gets tapped into by a candle and rejected off of. So you see this candle, the wick of this candle, it went 50% of the range, did not go any further, did not go any less than 50% of the range, and it rejected off this. So this increases the probability of this fair value gap. The only other thing that could increase the probability of this fair value gap even more is if we had a draw on liquidity on the downside for price to return to. I would not consider this a draw on liquidity because it is a double stack inversion fair value gap. And another thing would be is if we had a fair value gap on the left hand side to stack on top of this. You could see here this fair value gap, it's been mitigated by this candle. The range of this fair value gap was entered. Yeah, it was entered by this candle. So that's why this would not be considered a part of this area for a inversion fair value gap. Do you have any questions?
Is this part of fair value gap?
So this is a fair value gap. This was a draw on liquidity. You could see that this wick took this liquidity. So this is no longer no longer at the moment considered a draw on liquidity fair value gap. Do you have any other questions?
So you would take shorts from where the fair value gap was.
Yeah. So it's not the highest probability IOFED, but IOFEDs in itself are high probability. So you don't need all those other confluences in order to know that it's going to go lower. The only problem is we don't have a very good draw on liquidity, meaning that we don't know how far it's going to go exactly, but we know that it's going to go down, most likely. Do you have any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. All right, guys. Thank you guys for watching. Check out Conrad's channel below. Subscribe, like, join Liquidity Lab LLC, join Traders Domain, join my community server, get a Apex account down below with a discount. Do you have anything you want to say?
Nope. I'm just glad I learned a lot.
Peace out.